Send forth the flaming camels!
Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. The last definitive edition patch came out just before April Fools and gave a new unique unit to the Tatars. Some people seem skeptical of whether this was a prank or not, but it looks like it's here to stay. Assuming that's the case, for this video, let's investigate how good it actually is. The most obvious comparison to something we already know is, of course, the petard. Side by side, you can see it's a bit less armor for the flaming camel, and both seem to have low attack for a one-time use, so their hidden bonus damage is going to be pretty important. They have a similar creation time from the castle, and the cost is, I think, comparable, with the flaming camel being a bit more expensive. You can upgrade their HP with bloodlines, speed with husbandry, and their damage against buildings with siege engineers. Unfortunately, you also need to research the Tatar's Imperial Age unique tech in order to unlock them. In addition to giving you access to the flaming camel, that tech also gives your trebuchets 2 more range. Now you might just think the flaming camel seems like a faster version of the petard, but I don't think that's correct. In fact, it's pretty obvious the flaming camel is not meant to be an anti-building unit. They only do a little over 100 damage against buildings with siege engineers, whereas the petard does more than 5 times that much, and over 15 times the damage against walls and gates. Against castles, the flaming camel does roughly 14 stone worth of damage, whereas the petard is doing about 100 stone worth. The point is, throwing your camels against buildings is a massive waste of resources, and unfortunately, if you put them on attack ground stance, they're just as happy to run into enemy buildings as they are enemy units. Likewise, the petard also excels against siege, doing an extra 60 bonus damage, while the flaming camel has no bonus there. For those reasons, I wouldn't call the flaming camel a faster petard. In fact, the single-use aspect is all they really have in common. In fact, I think a better way to categorize them would be as a single-use version of the Halberdier. Their bonus damage is primarily against cavalry, including camels, where they do 50 extra attack. Like Halberdiers, their bonus is even larger against elephants as well. Those are all units you would never get value out of using a petard against. A side note here is the flaming camel never does quite as much damage as you'd think it should on paper. Against elephants, for example, they should be doing 147 damage, but they only do 121 in practice. The attack bonus doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, as their damage depends on how close the center of both units are to each other when the explosion happens. They would only do their full damage if they were in fact standing right on top of the target, which is impossible. That said, blast damage is a net positive thing, since even if they aren't completely taking out individual units, they can hit multiple units at once, greatly adding to their value. The area of their blast is 1.5 tiles, which is considerably less than the demo ship line, but more than the petard. Closer units naturally take more damage than ones near the outer edge of that range, with the explosion doing full damage at the epicenter as it were, and a proportional drop-off depending on how far away the unit is. Again, notice in this example, it never does its full damage, since it's always some distance away from the center of even the closest unit. Keeping all that in mind, to get a ballpark estimate of how good they are against various units, I decided to look at how many enemy targets you would need to hit at once in order to justify their cost. For example, if it needs to have 20 of a type of unit in range to justify its cost, that would be an obviously bad matchup and seems close to impossible to do consistently. If, on the other hand, it only needs 1 or 2 of an enemy type in its range to be cost effective, that's potentially a good matchup. By weighing the cost of the camel against the percentage of the target unit's HP lost combined with its cost, we can get a rough idea of how many of that type of unit it needs to hit to give value in the long run. I'll also assume here it's only doing half of its damage, since that's what it does to units 3/4 of a tile away, and as we've seen, they never do the full damage to every unit around them. So if you're okay with how that is being calculated, then here's what we get. Against champions, they need to average between 11 and 12 in range to give good value, which is really hard to do consistently. That's not necessarily a bad thing since we don't expect them to do well against champions given their lack of bonus damage, but it's nice to have that confirmed. It's a similar thing against Halberdiers, where getting 12 units with every hit is tough even against a large group. As a general rule, unless you're getting an amazing shot, they're just not going to be cost efficient against infantry. Switching to cavalry though, taking a look at the Hussar, you get more like 3 to 4. I think that's a little more reasonable, and assuming a game with equal access to trade and infinite gold, they should actually be able to trade in total resources against Hussars fairly well. In a 1 vs 1 with bottomed out market prices and selling food to fill their gold costs though, you need to hit 10 at once, so that's not a great trade. Against Chinese Cavaliers, which are fully upgraded but don't have any extra bonuses, they need to average hitting 3.4. That sounds pretty easy to do, but all of this is a bit tougher in practice. In this example, with 10 flaming camels charging into the middle of 15 Cavaliers, it ended up only being roughly equal in terms of value lost. The point is, it's not impossible, but can be tough to get good value against heavy cavalry. On the extreme end, against the Frank paladin, you need to average hitting 4 or 5. It's possible if you can get in the midst of a bunch of them, but it's not always a given. Where we start to see them do better is against heavy cavalry archers and camels. As long as you can get 2 or 3 units in range, you can get equal value, which is definitely possible when you're up against larger numbers. Cavalry archers are a tough one to assess though, since they can pick off camels with micro and get great value, but at the same time ranged units also tend to stick together, which is great for flaming camels. I end up getting a pretty similar calculation with elephants as well. Even though their bonus is much larger and elephants cost more, they also have more HP, so they end up giving pretty similar value against Khmer battle elephants as Saracen heavy camels. Again, hitting 2 or 3 units on average is pretty reasonable to do, so I think they should be viable there, especially against large numbers. Remember, with all of these, if your opponent has a small number of units or is using staggered formation, it's going to be really hard to get these numbers. And they are balanced so that they'll never be cost effective when attacking units one at a time. Against archers, for example, it seems possible to hit 7 on average, but archers can also pick off your units before you reach them. Indian elephant archers and Khmer ballista elephants are also unique in that respect. I think in this case, it comes down to whether or not you're able to put something in front of the camels to distract the elephant projectiles until it's too late. Remember, your own units aren't damaged by the explosion, so you can mix and match units easily. Another question some of you guys asked is whether or not they take bonus damage like ships. As far back as African kingdoms, towers only do 1 extra damage against camels, which isn't affected by heated shot. The short answer is no, camels are no longer ships of the desert. Now, one thing I do want to touch on if you're using them is that they're created on no attack stance by default. This is arguably better than having them on aggressive stance, as they'll often detonate before getting properly surrounded. That said, you can intentionally let them pass into an enemy formation before switching them to aggressive stance or using shift and delete to detonate them all at once. In case you're wondering, they deal the same damage whether they were destroyed by an enemy or you deleted them yourself. So to put it all together, I wouldn't say they're an overpowering unit, but I think they can still play a role. With the right enemy composition, especially camels and elephants, they can certainly give value, especially when you're outnumbered. On the other hand, the fact that they're useless against buildings and many different units means you also have to be really careful not to waste them. Like demo ships, you have to pick your spots, and you wouldn't want your entire army to be made of nothing but flaming camels. But with reasonable numbers, you can certainly get some value and some style points at the same time. That's all for this one though. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.